Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. The organizers just asked me to start this plenary session. This is a very special plenary session. Let me first say that it is indeed a great privilege for me to participate in this very special forum. I would like to thank organizers for inviting me. This session, plenary session, is about the Bretton Woods system, G20, and the future of global monetary and financial architecture. Indeed, I suppose all of you agree with me in saying that the organizers were quite ambitious to have us cover all these heavily loaded subjects in very limited time span. So what I would like to suggest panelists to do is this, and that is that you focus on these very heavy loaded subjects only in the context of discussing current financial crisis, current financial economic crisis. Having said that, I'll very briefly to put the Bretton Woods system, G20, and the future of global monetary financial architecture in the context of discussing the crisis. I'm very sure many of you would agree with me and also in saying that the world is still not quite out of the worst economic and financial crisis since the Great Depression of 1930s. So it is very critical for us to understand the major causes of the current crisis so that we can find ways to remedy the situation and at the same time to find ways to prevent the recurrence of such crisis in the future. Unfortunately, however, as you know very well, there are multiple factors involved and interrelated factors involved. So I'm very sure that thousands of dissertations, PhD dissertations, and the books and articles will be written on the subject in coming years. But fortunately, even at this point, there are a number of factors already identified to be major causes, and many experts and specialists agree on these the factors as major causes. One of them is inadequate financial, the regulatory and the supervisory regime at both national and global community level. And the second factor is global economic imbalances. So when you talk about inadequate the inadequate financial, regulatory, supervisory infrastructure, which can be broadly defined as financial architecture, even at the national financial architecture or international financial architecture. So these two subjects are already there. In discussing current crisis, we can talk about this inadequacy of existing financial architecture and doing something about it. And then we also see if enough is done so far, if something is done, and to see if more needs to be done. So this is one point. And second factor, which I pointed out as saying that many experts and analysts already agree on, is global imbalance is one of the major causes. So by definition, global imbalance, it involves not only one country, but more than one country. So what it means is that the global community needs to make a concerted effort to remedy the situation. Here comes in the G20. So you can tie all together this way. As you know, the G20 summit began last year. As you know, the G20 finance ministers have been held during the last 10 years, since 1999. But the summit just began last November in Washington, D.C. The heads of the 20 largest and most important economies gathered together to discuss the current unprecedented global economic and financial crisis and do something about it. And then, more importantly, they agreed to meet again April this year in London. And then the third meeting is scheduled to be held in Pittsburgh this coming September 24th and 25th. I'm very proud to say that Korea, as a part of Troika, been playing very, very important and leading role in cooperation with the rest of the G20 partners, and particularly the chairing countries, and UK so far, and Brazil. And for fourth meeting, we are very closely working with the United States. And as you know, the Lady Summers, who is the head of the National Economic Council, is leading this U.S. endeavor of holding the Pittsburgh G20. And his office, the National Economic Council, is directly involved. His deputy, Mike Froman, is working very closely with us, and actually our Mr. An Ho-yeon, who is our Sherpa for G20, is here, and he's Mike Froman's counterpart, and we've been working very closely with them. And also UK, and John Conliffe, who is senior counselor to the Gordon Brown, and working on it. So anyway, we were doing our best. We're trying to do our part, and to get G20 produce something deliverable, something achievable, and something can be implemented, rather than make it another photo session and a feast of rhetoric. And I think the world community, particularly financial communities, reacted quite positively the particular outcome of the last London summit. But anyway, so G20 is there. I think this is one of the factors which makes the current situation quite different from the situation the world had in 1930s, which will make the duration of this recession much shorter, I'm very sure. And I'm sure that in the course of discussion, maybe we'll discuss some of the exit strategies, at least the preparation of exit strategies. Well, with this, I don't want to spend more time, but maybe later on I will come in to intervene during the panelist discussion. So I want to shorten my opening remark. Well, we have a very interesting group of panelists. In fact, we're supposed to have one more panelist with the Standard Chartered JL Bank president. Apparently, he has some health problems, so he couldn't come. So we have four excellent the panelists, very interesting. They're from financial markets expert, markets and politics and academia and research. Let me very briefly introduce them to you in alphabetical order. Sitting next to the right-hand side is Mr. Scott Kelp, who is currently the Chief Investment Officer of Korean Investment Corporation, which is an investment management institution set up by the Korean government in July 2003 to manage a part of Korea's foreign exchange reserve and other public funds. He's a very important man. He made a lot of money. And he joined KIC very recently, but he spent more than 20 years in the international financial field, in particular in asset management and in research. So he knows the market. And actually, I had the privilege of working with him actually since the mid-'80s, and he knows Korea. Scott knows Korea very well as well. And he also has very strong academic background. He studied at Harvard University and then Oberlin University, and he had the various research engagement previously. And then we have Mr. Masahiro Kawai, who is one of the leading economists in in Japan, and currently he is the Dean and CEO of Asian Development Bank Institute in Tokyo. Mr. Kawai has had a very brilliant career in academia, and actually he served in the Japanese government as well. He was Deputy Vice Minister of Finance for International Affairs at the Ministry of Finance, and also he had experience working at the World Bank, and he has very wide range of experiences in teaching as well as research, and also he worked at the ADB, and he is very much involved in the East Asian financial cooperation and so forth. So we the fortunate to have him. And then we have Mr. David Daokui Lee. Apparently he's from China. He is actually director of the Center for China in the World Economy at the Tsinghua University, and this center is very prestigious in China, and he holds the Mansfield Freeman Professor of Economics at the Tsinghua University. But I know this is very interesting. The sentence in his resume says, his childhood was spent in Sichuan province as a result of his parents being displaced by the countryside during the Cultural Revolution. I found this very interesting. Maybe if you have time, you may talk about it a little later. But anyway, we are very glad to have you. He also has very strong academic background. He has a good training in the U.S. from the Harvard University. And then we have the Mr. Kataro Tamura, who is the only politician around. He is the member of House of Councilors in the Japanese Diet, and but interestingly enough, he is currently in politics, but he has also experience in business and academia. He also had academic training in the U.S. and in Japan, and he taught at various universities and institutes. So all four panelists have different backgrounds from different fields, but one thing in common, that is that they have very strong academic background, so they can see these things in a more theoretical framework. Well, with this, I think I will invite panelists to make a lead statement. Maybe since we have about an hour, 10 minutes or so I'll give you, each of you, this initial statement for 10 minutes, if needed, maybe 10 to 15 minutes maximum, so that we'll have more interactions with the floor as well as among yourself. Okay, Scott, you want to start?
Well, I'd like to thank the organizers of the 5th Jeju Peace Forum for inviting me today, and the esteemed panel members. I'm honored to join you, and also the chairman of our panel today, Dr. Salgong. I have a few remarks. I just would like to make it clear that I am neither a policymaker nor, despite Dr. Sagong's very nice introduction, a real academic. I'm really just a simple investor. And so what I would like to do today is to give you my perspective as an investor on what's going on or the challenges that I see facing currently the global financial markets. And in particular, I'd like to focus my comments on two areas. One is the increased role of government in the global economy, especially in the West. And the second is the increased role of emerging Asian countries in the global economy. And then I'd like to focus a few comments on how I think the G20 can help us in working on these challenges. First, regarding the role of government, I would say that we're currently living through a period in history of unprecedented government support and dominance in the global economy. In the Western countries, especially in the U.S., over the past few decades, the private sector accumulated too much debt relative to cash flow and asset values. And demand in the U.S. became horribly skewed toward increasingly over-indebted consumers. In fact, the total amount of credit outstanding at over 350% of GDP by the end of 2007 became far greater than the amount of money available to repay it. When payment comes due and it's crunch time, there really are only two ways out of a dilemma. Either asset values need to be written down, deleveraging basically leads to deflation, or money needs to be created to pay back the debt, leading ultimately to inflation. And in fact, we've got both of these happening right now. The private sector has written off massive amounts of bad debt. It's continuing to do so, and this is limiting its ability to create or access new debt and to consume. Governments, in the meantime, have responded quickly and with overwhelming force in this crisis, creating money through quantitative easing and using the proceeds to buy up bad debt and also to buy up bankrupt assets. Governments also have been spending to take up the slack from the weakened private sector and have become the leading source of demand. In the U.S., for example, an increase in the budget deficit of 12 percentage points has helped to cushion the slumping private sector demand. Finally, governments have cut interest rates dramatically in an effort to stimulate spending and create credit. Already interest rates are at such low levels, they are in fact close to zero, that there's little scope to cut further to provide more stimulation. These swift actions taken by governments globally, even in the face of a lot of institutional barriers, especially in the U.S., have effectively eliminated the credit crunch and removed the risk of deflationary depression that loomed large over the world financial markets last year. Essentially, the global financial system has moved off of life support and is now in stable condition, with many key vital signs showing improvement. This is a tremendous accomplishment, and we should all be grateful to the wise policymakers behind these moves. I feel a little strange making such a statement because normally there is a direct and negative correlation between government actions and the movement of financial markets. But clearly, this time around, it's not the case. The G20 has also played a major role in this process. Leaders from the G20 nations announced at the London Forum last April $1 trillion in new spending through the International Monetary Fund. This is the largest fiscal and monetary stimulus and the most comprehensive support program in modern times. And that comes directly from the G20 communique. The problem, of course, is that government intervention is at best a temporary solution to the problems that we face. We will need to prepare the way for what comes after, even as we struggle to stabilize the global economy now. Next, regarding Asia, I find it's at the opposite end of the spectrum. The emerging Asian, typically creditor countries, are very competitive in world markets. They have excess savings and are just beginning domestic debt expansion, so their capacity to acquire and to support increased debt service is very strong. These countries stimulated their economies in the same way as the Western countries in the face of the economic crisis. But unlike the developed world, there's been a more meaningful reaction, including stronger credit creation and economic growth. In this regard, China is leading the way and has become the new locomotive for the global economy. With output growing at a 16% annualized rate between April and June, China's imports are up by 21% year over year, and they have become the biggest positive force in global demand, especially benefiting countries that produce what it needs, like Korea and Australia. Developed and emerging nations alike should be grateful for the leadership and support that has been provided to the global economy through intervention in China and in the face of this crisis. However, in China we face a different problem. While in the West there may be danger from removing stimulus too soon, in China there's a serious risk of economic overheating. Much of the 30% debt growth in China may have gone toward the purchase of domestic stocks and other speculative investments. When speculative assets are bought on borrowed money, it's a sign that a bubble may be emerging. This decoupling between the West and Asia is likely to continue in the years ahead, in much the same way as there was decoupling between the rest of the world and Japan during Japan's deleveraging of the 1990s, and between the developed world and Latin America during Latin America's deleveraging of the 1980s. It's likely to be reflected in increased trade within Asia, in my view, relative to trade between Asia and the rest of the world. It also is likely to result in emerging Asian countries wanting to diversify their investments overseas from the purchases of debt towards the purchase of assets. So how do I view these developments as an investor, and how can the G20 help us face some of these challenges? One of the tenets of modern portfolio management is rebalancing. When portfolio weightings get out of whack due to price movements, the disciplined portfolio manager will take the initiative to rebalance and will move the portfolio weightings back in line. Thus, if the stock market moves up too much, the portfolio manager will sell some of his stocks and add to fixed income, for example, to reestablish proper policy portfolio weightings and to reduce risk. Mean reversion dictates that if the portfolio manager fails to rebalance, financial markets will force it to happen anyway, and usually in a very messy way, and thus any profits earned previously could be lost. Well, this is what's happening in the global economy now. The crisis is effectively correcting the enormous imbalances that went unaddressed for so many years, and it's doing it in a very messy way. The credit crunch and the destruction of more than $13 trillion of household net worth has irrevocably wrecked the highly levered U.S. shopping machine that drove global growth. For better or worse, in the U.S., savings are growing now and debt is shrinking. The U.S. current account deficit will fall to less than 3% of GDP from over 6% previously. On the other hand, surpluses in creditor countries like Japan and China are shrinking at a very fast pace, while the external lending and export machines are slowly breaking down. For example, about 75% of China's growth this year will come from public spending or government-induced lending rather than from exports. Rebalancing through economic crisis is a cruel way to correct past excesses, but as Rahm Emanuel, the White House Chief of Staff to President Obama, said, we should never let a good crisis go to waste. In other words, we should be taking steps to make sure that we don't have such a forced rebalancing in the future. In this regard, the G20 has a major role to play. First, the G20 must help to make sure that the global economy is stable and the recovery is firmly established before we can begin reforms. As an investor, I worry about the premature removal of economic stimulus measures. There remains a significant risk of another wave of economic contraction if the exit from loose monetary policy and fiscal spending is not properly timed, properly planned, and coordinated. I think the G20 is the right forum to manage this process. In Korea, there's an expression, and it goes, when whales fight, the shrimp gets its back broken. We might also add that when whales make love, the shrimp still gets its back broken. It's been a very difficult and volatile period over the last few years in the global economy, and a lot of backs have been broken. We need consistent policy coordination under the auspices of the G20 to ensure that the global economic environment remains safe and stable for everyone. As an investor, I'm sorry. Pardon me. Second, the G20 can also help to put pressure on global leaders to follow through with the microeconomic adjustments necessary to make sure that past imbalances are addressed. The solutions are well known. The thrifty creditor countries in Asia must become a bigger source of demand while moving away from being the manufacturing base for the world. At the same time, the former bubble economies in the West, heavy with debt, must continue to shift towards savings and exports and away from consumption-led growth. As an investor with a long-term time horizon, we look forward to participating in this process, and we are actively looking for mutually beneficial opportunities to do so. Third, the G20 can play a positive role in preventing the spread of protectionism. It's easy to succumb to the headwinds of local politics as unemployment rises and profits fall. But just as unbalanced trade got us into this mess, properly balanced, free and fair trade is probably our best hope to get us out of this mess. Finally, let me comment on the increased leadership role of emerging Asian countries in the global economy. I think the world can learn a lot from its Asian neighbors. Having suffered through the Asian crisis 10 years ago, it's no accident that Asian economies today are standing tall. Korea serves as a good example in this regard. In 1997, Korea's foreign exchange reserves were just $10 billion. Today, they're close to $250 billion. It's a 25-fold increase. Korea's balance sheet is very strong, and the same is true for China, as well as many other nations in Asia. Thus, while this crisis is painful, the suffering is not nearly as deep as in the West today, or as it was during the Asian crisis 10 years ago. Lessons have been learned, and proper policies have been implemented. I think it's also timely that Korea perhaps will step forward to lead the G20 forum next year. Korea can certainly help to make sure that the whales in the global economy do not roil the waters further and provide leadership toward better coordination. After all, it's not that long ago that Korea itself was one of the shrimps. In fact, 30 years ago, per capita GDP in Korea was less than $1,000. Today, it's around $20,000, and Korea is one of the top 10 or 15 economies in the world. It's not a shrimp anymore. This institutional memory, though, helps to provide a balanced perspective and the right mix of humility and success for Korea to lead the charge toward a more balanced future. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Scott. Well, very, very penetrating and illustrating the analysis of the current financial and economic crisis from his very special vantage point, and that is the financial markets. And thank you very much for the presentation. And you raised a very interesting questions there. I think the other panelists will touch on this. Actually, this morning, I think somewhere I read Paul Krugman said Ronald Reagan was wrong when he said sometimes the private sector is problem and the government is solution. And this is the time. But again, on that point, I suppose many people may argue on that thing. But there's certainly some the truth in it. I think the G20 and this global concerted endeavor is one factor which makes this depression recession could have been depression quite different from 1930s. Well, with this, Professor Kawai, please.
Thank you, Chairman Il-Sakon, and the organizers of this session for inviting me. What I'm going to talk about is basically three issues. Major causes of the global financial and economic crisis. Second, how to prevent future crises from the perspective of developed economies and also the global economy. And finally, I want to talk about Asia's policy agenda, and then how Asian leaders may want to express themselves for the G20 meeting in September. Now, basically, I almost agree with Dr. Ilsa Kohn and Mr. Kulp about the causes. Essentially, the realization of accumulated vulnerabilities in the U.S. and also Europe. Europe has not been an innocent region in that sense. In the case of the U.S., excessive liquidity reflecting U.S. lax monetary policy and inadequate financial supervision and regulation in the U.S. Now, the U.S. current account deficit, I think there is some debate about this, whether that was really the core, one of the fundamental causes behind the current crisis, or was it somehow, was it more like a result of the bubble, domestically generated bubble in the United States? But my sense is that this U.S. current account deficit did prolong the bubble in the United States, although it may not have been a direct cause of the crisis. Now, on Europe, many European countries had real estate bubble problems, and financial institutions in Europe had invested in Eastern European countries, the Baltics, countries like Iceland, and so forth. And of course, these financial institutions also purchased the so-called toxic assets. So in that sense, Europe was affected by the U.S. Crisis, but also Europe had own sources of crisis. Now, from the international perspective, weak international financial architecture is a very important factor. There was some under-assessment of spillovers of the U.S. Subprime crisis due to the bursting of housing bubble to the global economy and finance. And also, there was some inadequate understanding of the implications of global financial integration and financial innovation. Now, from these analyses, the measures for crisis prevention would be relatively straightforward. The epicenter of the current crisis, the United States, and to some extent Europe, the center of the global economy must maintain stable and sound macroeconomic and financial conditions. So the center economy